Welcome to the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm your host, Robin L. Owens, PhD, and this is where we dive in each week to give advice, tools, and tips for high-achieving, purpose-minded women who've written nonfiction books and want to amplify their message beyond the book. I'm a college professor, and when I'm not doing that, I am speaking, coaching, mentoring, and teaching high-achieving women who have written books how to use their books to make a bigger difference, have more impact, and purpose. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. We're so glad you're here and taking your time to listen into the podcast. I say that all the time. I will always say it. I can't appreciate you enough. There's so much you could be doing at this time, but listening to the podcast, really appreciate you. And today I'm talking with Brandi Olson. Now, let me tell you about Brandi. Brandi is the best-selling author of the book, Real Flow. Break the burnout cycle and unlock high performance in the new world of work. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to hear about that. And Brandi believes that you shouldn't have to choose between doing good, important work and your own humanity. She is an expert in organizational design and agility. And if that weren't enough, Brandi is the founder of Real Work Done. And she lives in Minnesota with her kids, dog, chickens, and garden. Welcome, Brandi Olson.
Hi, Robin. Thanks so much for welcoming me here.
I'm so glad you're here. And I'm looking forward to just jumping right in and hearing all about you. Now, I just read a little bit of your bio, but tell us more about you first and then your work.
Sure. So you know that I've got kids and I'm married and I've got chickens and a garden, and that directly infuses every part of my work because I think that the way that we work, the way that we design ourselves to work together in teams begins, ends with showing up as real humans. And the work that we're capable of is only possible when we actually are able to work as people together. And I think that that's what makes great companies run and great organizations. And so it's how I show up to the work that I do with the organizations that I lead to as a real life human being who is not always the most organized. And sometimes my humanity is terribly inconvenient, and it'd be a lot better if I could operate like a machine, but I can't. And that brings me to what my work is all about, which is helping leaders design organizations and teams that can respond to change and deliver on really great outcomes in the real world, in reality, because I really deeply believe that reality is the only place that good work happens. So the sooner we welcome it and embrace it, the sooner we can get on to figuring out what to do next.
Yes, and I love that. And talking about we're humans. We call it work, right? And it's like it's this thing, but really it's just a place of gathering of humans. Mm-hmm. And you said sometimes, you made a comment, sometimes your humanity is inconvenient. I would imagine that it shows up across the board for people. So tell us the way, give us an example of that, not just from you as a human, but the way humanity shows up in the world of work and business.
Yeah. So one of the things that I am endlessly curious about is how we collaborate, and particularly like how our brains and our bodies work to collaborate. One of the things that I've been researching a lot over the last few years is how our brains actually do the work that we need to do. And one of the persistent challenges that shows up when we are working in teams or we're trying to do important work is that we struggle with an abundance of important work and competing priorities. And we are trying to figure out how to get all the work done. One of the things that's true about our brains is that we actually don't multitask, right? But we try to all the time. But our brains actually aren't multitasking. We're constantly just switching back and forth between the different tasks that we need to do. And I bring this up because it's really important when it comes to how we work together, because if we don't understand that part about our brains, we can start to think that like we're deficient in some way because we're not so good at multitasking. Or, if you've ever had the feeling of being in meetings all day long and getting to the end of the day and just feeling exhausted, sometimes we can start to internalize that, like that feeling of being tired or exhausted is like an indication that maybe we're not the high performer that we think we are or that we need to be. And the reality is that we're exhausted because we're trying to force ourselves to work in a way that we're not designed to work, that constant switch back and forth. So it's one of those things that I come back to over and over again to see how can we shift our understanding about how we show up to do good work, and how can we reject some of those messages and ideas that are all around us about what it's supposed to mean to be good at our jobs, or to be a high performer, to be a exceptional, human being. I think we get a lot of messages and illusions about that don't serve us very well.
Yes, we really do. It's such important work, really important work. So now tell us again the title of your book. I mentioned it when we started, but remind everybody the title of your book, and then tell us the main message.
Yeah. So my book is called Real Flow: Break the Burnout Cycle and Unlock High Performance in the New World of Work. And this is a book that's really written for anybody who works as part of a team, or, has an abundance of important work to get done. But it's especially written for leaders who have the ability to choose and design their organizations and their teams in a way that prevents burnout and really allows people to show up and do good work together and achieve the great outcomes that they're actually capable of. And what I bring together in the book is the cost of competing priorities, the cost of organizational multitasking, and the heavy toll that takes on people and humans, the way it contributes to burnout, and the way that pursuing everything at the same time actually diminishes our outcomes, and it diminishes what we're actually capable of as humans and as teams. So I wrote that book to connect those ideas, to connect understanding why does how we choose our work and how much we pursue at one time, how is that contributing to this real human suffering of burnout, having to choose between doing good work and your own well-being? Mm-hmm. And what's the real cost of that? Because the real cost is actually that we're not performing at the level that we actually could. Our expectations are too low already because we're not working in really human-centered ways.
Yes, I can imagine that. And when I think about burnout, so many other consequences of experiencing burnout, which I'm sure you probably have read or studied or experienced in other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, burnout causes real harm and suffering. And I think oftentimes we treat burnout as an individual problem because it shows up as in individuals. But the reality is in organizations, burnout's the result of a system that's not designed to work for humans. And so to create an organization that doesn't cause burnout really requires looking at how the entire organization is woven together. And we need to start looking at burnout as a collective problem, not just an individual problem.
Yes. And I'm taking mental notes for myself, even now, as I'm kind of developing my own team. And for people who are listening, who are small business owners, who are even with smaller teams, not just larger organizations and larger teams.
Absolutely.
Burnout, I'm sure, is an issue. All right. So tell us how you come to this work. What brings you to doing this work?
Yeah. So I come to this work through a wide, varied kind of professional background. My education, my early career was in education. So I used to be a high school special education teacher. And when I stopped teaching, I slowly morphed into a variety of projects and engagements that led me to the work that I do now around organizational design. But the thread that's always been true for me in my early career and in the work that I do with organizations, and that came through so strongly for me as I was even writing, was that I deeply believe that how well we learn together how to do better is the most important competitive advantage that any organization has and that any of us have as people. How do we learn? How do we grow? And how do we shift and change as a result of that learning is the core to my work. And that has always been true in every single job I've ever had, is I'm endlessly fascinated by how do we learn? How do we do it together?
I love it. And you're lit up when you talked about that too.
Mm-hmm. I can't hide it.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful to experience. All right. So now we talked earlier before we came on about being an author, and I said to you, I'm focusing on the listeners who are consultants or business owners, but they're also authors, but they tend not to gravitate toward this title of author. So, talk for a minute about your own experience about this understanding of yourself as an author or writer.
Yeah, it has been a journey for me. In fact, I would say that for a long time, I would have actively said, well, I'm not a writer. I'm not an author. And I ultimately, I chose to write this book because it came out of my teaching and my speaking experience. So consultant, speaker, I love speaking and teaching, and you get this instant feedback about how somebody, understands your words and can adapt and adjust. And I would have said for a really long time, like, well, books are so static. And while I can learn a lot through books, they felt very static to me. And yet I started to recognize that they also become this way for people to engage with a new idea that is really accessible and allows them to engage with a new idea kind of on their own terms, which is both interesting and kind of terrifying for me because you write something and then it goes out into the world and I don't get to see your instant reaction to it. And you're going to make meaning out of it that might be different than the meaning I intended. And so it's an act of kind of vulnerability in creating a book and writing a book. But I felt like it was a really important step in creating space for the conversation that I really wanted to have, which is how do we design companies that don't burn people out? So I started writing, and my writing process was really up and down. I started writing right before the pandemic kind of unfolded in our community. And so my writing journey is interwoven with my entire experience of pandemic life and parenting then. And throughout the whole process, I still wouldn't have identified myself as a writer and author, except that then in the beginning of October, my book came out and I was a writer and a published author. And over the last, 6 or 7 weeks, I've started to recognize that owning that language, like identifying as an author and identifying as a writer, is something that's been really empowering. And hearing and engaging in conversations and feedback with readers has created a really different kind of relationship, and I'm loving it. And I'm actually starting to think about, gosh, how can I write more? And where else do I want to go with this rather than, well, I wrote that book, but that's not really me. I'm really starting to find a different relationship with my book and the space that it creates and the connection it creates with my readers.
I love hearing that. Love hearing that. And in addition to that, because it sounds like that was the joy was bubbling up, what is another thing that you could say is one of your big joys around this whole process of writing and or publishing and or promoting your book?
I think one of my greatest joys is seeing the conversations that are happening. And actually, I heard from a reader a couple of weeks ago who told me that they took one of the sketches in my book and they drew that out for a meeting that they were leading with some of their peers at their organization. And they all had a conversation about what well-being and high performance meant, which is one of the things that I talk about in the book, that we have to stop treating well-being as something that's on the opposite end of the spectrum from high performance, as if they're mutually exclusive. But that reader told me about that conversation that they had and then what ensued. And it just delighted me so much that they felt like the sketch itself was accessible enough that they could recreate it and that they got to have this conversation that I got to support, but it wasn't even mine, it was theirs. And it just was so lovely and delightful to hear about, and created just this sense of like, gosh, all those, long days. Cause I also wouldn't identify as a illustrator. And yet my book has lots of sketches in it. And to see that me putting myself out there and stretching myself with new skills and new ways of communicating made a difference. Right. And to be able to hear about that, that's just incredibly honoring. It was a huge honor to know that
Yes.
that work was impacting their conversations.
Yes. And all the people that it will impact because they had that conversation. The ripple
Mhm.
go out.
Exactly.
And good for you for venturing out there with your creativity and doing the illustrations and doing all the things. Good for you.
Ooh, I know that illustrations are a good way to learn. And because learning is core to who I am, I also thought if I draw these, then they're gonna feel accessible and somebody might feel like they could draw it too, right? As opposed to feeling like, oh, that's this like idea that you have to have a lot of skills to be able to use sketch and illustration visualizations. maybe it would help other people understand that they can do that too.
And hearing from that reader lets you know that it did exactly that.
Yeah, it was worth it.
Yeah, it's probably so many more than just that one person.
Mm-hmm.
So you met your intention. Okay, so now on the other side, what would you say was your biggest challenge in the process of either writing or publishing the book?
My biggest challenge was time to write. I had talked to a lot of writers and authors prior to beginning my writing process. And so many people talked about the importance of a writing habit and blocking out regular time to write. And I did that. I planned ahead so that I could have like 6 months of less client work and a lot more space to write. And I kicked it off with a writing retreat, and I had 6 months ahead of me to write. And turns out my writing retreat was at the end of February 2020.
Oh,
And I went on my writing retreat and I had my great big plan. And then I came home to a shutdown and my kids were out of school and we have a small family business. And that was deeply impacted by the pandemic. And I've got caregiving and my world just shifted, right? So dramatically. And so the time that I had set aside to write, it didn't vaporize, but it needed to be filled with different emerging priorities. And while it seemed like this was going to be my top priority, what I didn't know is that responding to a pandemic was going to become my emerging top priority. I live in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and the summer of 2020 was when George Floyd was murdered. And my neighborhood was right in the middle of that. And my community was just in turmoil. And that whole 6 months that I had, I didn't know that I was going to need to respond to my community and be part of it and show up and care for my family in the ways that I did. So my writing time vanished. And even though it was like a priority on my business plan, it was getting none of my actual brain space. So I had to experiment in a lot of different ways with what to do about that. And at different points in my writing journey, I had to take my own advice, which was to limit my work in progress and say, my book's important, but it's not hitting the top 5 most important things for me right now. I need to put it back on the shelf because trying to make a little bit of progress on it every day and every week was absolutely like unending to me. Like it was just not possible. And so I was in this constant state of I'm never doing enough, not doing good enough. So I would put it down and walk away from it and then bring it back again. And ultimately what I found to work for me was not making progress every day, not even making progress every week, because it took me so much time to like get into the headspace to write.
yes.
So I really wrote the book through writing sprints, and I would work really hard to like block out a long weekend and go away or, hole up in a part of my house and make sure my family had lots of fun things to do. And I would write as much as I could. And then when that weekend was over, I'd set it down and I'd plan out my next writing sprint. So at least I like knew when the next one was coming. And so that's how I got the book done. But it was not at all what I expected it to be. And I had to really understand like what that process worked, how that worked for me. Because it wasn't working for me how it worked for other authors and other writers that I had talked to.
Right, which I think is key, right? Doing it our way, whether it's writing a book or whatever it is. And you found the way that worked for you in the midst of all that was going on in life all around you.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's a critical lesson that you learned and that you did it. And good for you. And look, all the better for you having pushed through that and getting it done in your own.
Yeah, bit by bit and with a lot of grace. So much grace for what I thought the process would be like and what it turned out to be like. And I think you said it so well that it doesn't look the same for everybody, and it shouldn't, and it doesn't have to.
Yes, we are our own people. So you're a good model of that. Or so what would you say when you think about the book? What part of the book reflects who you are?
What a great question. I think that the part of the book that reflects who I am is this real sense of pragmatism. And core to, I shared I'm a learner. I love learning. I love helping other people learn. I also have this really deep commitment to reality. And I think that comes from my days of teaching, in which I could learn lots of great things, but if it didn't actually help me solve a problem in my classroom today or tomorrow, I probably didn't have time for it. So it didn't matter how great the idea was if it didn't make my job as a teacher better right away or help me to move forward, it was really hard to implement. And I think that a lot of leaders struggle with that as well. And so as I was writing the book, I was really looking at what's pragmatic and how do we take these big ideas and make them really pragmatic, and so that others can see that they can take smaller actions right now that will actually have a big impact, that you don't have to wait till you have a master plan to make the changes that you need to make in your organization or as a leader. And I think that it was a theme for me on every single page, really looking at it and saying, is this word essential? Do I really need to tell this story? Could I take it out? Because I wanted the book to feel accessible. I wanted you to hold the book in your hand and be like, I could skim this. And it's okay if you skim it. In fact, I wrote it in a way that has headings and subtitles that make it very skimmable, because that might be all you have time for. And so that sense of pragmatism, I think, really comes through in the book. And it's kind of core to how I operate in the world. It's got to work in reality. And if it doesn't, we got to figure out what to do better and differently, because reality is all we have.
Yes, yes, reality is all we have. Was there a moment or a catalyst or some reflection or experience with burnout? I know you mentioned you wanted to extend your teaching and that you love learning, but was there something specific related to burnout that helped usher you into this particular expression of the book?
There was one interaction that I had with a leader that I was working with, and I tell the story in the book. Her name's Susanna. She worked at a biotech company, and she'd been there for about 10 years. And this organization was doing really groundbreaking research in cancer treatment. And I was brought in to help do kind of a team performance assessment. So chief people officer brought me in to do this assessment, and that involved interviewing lots of people. And I was talking to Susanna, and she was describing to me how she was regularly pulling like 60-hour weeks. And she was taking on more work because somebody had left and they'd asked her to take over the secondary lab. And she said yes, because the work was really important and she was really passionate about it. And she said, I think that exhaustion is just the price to pay to be a high performer. And then a couple sentences later, she also told me that she was starting to think about looking for another job because she just wasn't sure how much longer she could go at this pace. And I think hearing that story and talking to Susanna was like the seed for this book, and recognizing that I don't agree. I don't think exhaustion is the price to pay for high performance. In fact, I think that it's really short-sighted, because I really think that high performance is about sustaining better outcomes over time. And it's about sustainability. And that too often we put people in positions where they have to choose between doing good work and their own humanity. And Susanna was in that position. And what I really started thinking about is what I wish Susanna's leader knew about what she was talking about, right? Because if Susanna left that organization, they were going to experience a huge loss of knowledge and expertise. And that was going to be incredibly hard for them to overcome. And yet they kept putting her in positions where she was working longer hours, and she was burned out. And that was the seed for the book. Just recognizing that she was in this impossible decision, impossible choice. And it wasn't good for her, and it wasn't good for her company either.
Yes. So did she end up leaving, or did she stay? Or do we have to wait and read it in the book?
She actually wound up staying. And the work that we got to do with that organization really helped to shift how they prioritized their work and how they structured it in a way that made it more human-centered so that they could get more of the right things done. So it was really, a powerful experience and really had a great outcome. But that's not always the way it ends, right? And so So Susanna stayed. She continues to do great work.
Yeah.
And they're still in that struggle of being more human in the way that they choose their work, but they're on the journey figuring it out.
Yes, good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that it turned out. And yeah, most of the stories that I know don't turn out in that way. So it's good to know that there was a shift made that worked out it sounds like the positive for everyone involved.
Yeah, it can happen. I think that's the thing that, it is hard. And it's not always the most likely outcome, but it absolutely is possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad to hear that. All right. So this podcast is for what I call purpose-minded, high-achieving women who have written nonfiction books, as we talked about earlier, and they want to make a difference in other people's lives. So they do different types of work, Many of them are small business owners, consultants, coaches, but they've written books to make a difference in relation to their work. So now, based on your expertise and experience, what's one piece of advice or a tip you can give to the woman I just described?
The tip that I have, what I was thinking about here is to treat your book like a member of your team. And because of course, we write because we want to make a difference in the world. My greatest joy in the writing experience, right? I shared is hearing that somebody took this and used it in the organization and it made a difference for them. Also, I run a business and I have work that I'm doing in the world, and that is okay, right? And it's okay that I'm going to make money from my book, and it's okay that my book is going to serve a purpose for me. And the way that I got really comfortable with that, because I wasn't very comfortable with that to begin with, but the way that I got comfortable with it was to start viewing my book as a member of my team. I'd pay a member of my team to show up and be part of my team and help open doors and help create conversations and help me explain and communicate my message to the world. And I absolutely would take somebody's money to pay for their time, right? Like it's an exchange of value that when I think about it as a member of my team, I don't feel so bad about. And it helped me really get out of the mindset of like, well, I'm just writing the book to make a difference in the world, or I'm writing it to make money. And it helped me see like that's not the wrong, or that's not the right frame of mind for me. So when I started thinking about what job do I want this book to do on my team? How do I want it to work for me? How do I want it to be part of my team? It helped me get so much more clear about why I was writing, how I wanted to write, and how I wanted the book to show up and be a good team member.
That is really a unique perspective that I really appreciate.
Mm.
Can you share with us, and you don't have to, what you decided on the role of this new team member, your book?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I want this book to be a great connector. I would identify as I was going to say I would identify as an introvert. And I've been thinking lately about that whole spectrum. I don't think is particularly helpful. So I'll take it back. But I do want my book to be a great connector. I want my book to be the member of my team that's out there meeting people. And, I imagine even though a book can't talk, I imagine they're listening to people and understanding like, hey, what's going on here? Could I tell you a story? Right? Oh, this reminds me of somebody else I wish you could meet. Right. I'd love to connect you to this leader that we know and that we've worked with. And so I imagine the book to be that great connector, reaching out and connecting people to each other, to a different perspective, and then opening that door for a conversation. Because what I love to do is, while I am finding my love for writing, I also love to speak, to lead workshops and facilitate and coach leaders. And so the book working as my connector helps me to connect more readily with the people who I can create value for and be of service to. And that, I think I'm already seeing the book's a good team member.
I love that. The great connector. I love that. It's an important idea to think about, and I'm sure others can resonate with that. All right. So now, the title of the podcast is Leadership Purpose. So let me ask you a question. Is the idea of having a sense of purpose in your work important to you? If so, why? If not, why not?
I want to say yes and no, right? So absolutely, like there's meaning and purpose, why I show up, why I do the work that I do, fuels the choices that I make and the prioritization that I make. If I didn't have a sense of purpose, I would have a really difficult time prioritizing how to spend my time. And I think I've dealt with that at various points, maybe where my purpose has gotten murky. And I also find myself busier than I want to be, saying yes to things that maybe I should say no to, and kind of losing my way. So my sense of purpose absolutely drives the choices that I make and where I invest in my work, and who I choose to work with, who I choose not to work with, all of those things. But I say no too, because I also have this clear sense that my work is not my life. And while I am really invested in my work, I wouldn't describe my business as my life's work. I think my life's work is how I show up as a human, right? The relationships that I have, how I show up just as Brandi Olson, not Brandi Olson, founder of Real Work Done. So I skirt this line, right? So I say yes and no, because it depends on the perspective that I'm looking at it from.
Yes, yes. I love that. Love that. Yeah, and I make a distinction. I use the term leadership purpose to make a separation from this idea of life purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Because early on
Yes.
in my work, when I talked about purpose, people associated with this life purpose. And it seemed for lots of people that I spoke to almost unattainable. And it was for other people. And it was grandiose, like solving the homelessness issue or some big thing that only was limited for a few for their life. So it was my way to try to express this idea of expressing purpose through the work that you do. And I call that leadership purpose because I think we all are leaders in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
I really resonate with that. And I think that makes so much sense and is a really helpful way to frame it because it kind of frees us from having to have it all figured out.
Yes. Yes. And as high performers and high achieving women, we like having it all.
We do.
We do. And myself included. Brandi, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to share that we haven't discussed yet before you tell people how they can get in touch with you?
Well, you've offered just the gift of such wonderful questions. So I really enjoyed being able to share what I have. I don't know that I have. I should have something brilliant else. I think perhaps it's just to continue to look at the way you show up and maybe to consider being a writer, right? Or identifying in that way. I think that's been so pivotal for me and help me to be more comfortable with the work that I'm doing and what's possible. And so that question that you asked, even as we've been talking, is shaped my own thinking about that. And I think it's a worthwhile question for all of us to consider.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And thank you for your generosity and sharing from your wisdom, clear wisdom here today and your thoughtfulness. And I'm guessing that there are people right now listening saying, how can I get that book? Or how can I hear more? Or how can I be in touch with Brandi Olson? So let them know how they can connect with you.
Well, I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. That is the online space that I create conversations with. And if you want to connect around writing or leadership, I would love to connect with you there. You can find me there. I'm Brandi Olson on LinkedIn. You can also find me at my website, realworkdone.com. There's links to all the places where you can buy the book. You can go find it on Amazon or your independent bookstore if you choose. And what else? I also have a letter that I write twice a month. Real Work Together. And I would love to have you join that and be in the company of other great leaders trying to figure out how do we design ourselves and our teams and organizations for effective collaboration. Would love to hear from you in any of those places.
Sounds amazing. Okay, everyone, you heard that. We'll make sure we put them in the show notes. Brandi, thank you so much for your time and all that you bring with your generosity and spirit. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. It has been an absolute honor.
And a joy for me. Okay, everyone. And if you are thinking about, we've been talking about books and work and being an author. And if you are a consultant and you've written a book and you dare call yourself an author or not, and you've been thinking about how to spread that message more broadly, I am happy to share with you my expertise gleaned from years of teaching to help you turn your book into what I call a masterful course. So you can just head on over to my free 4-part video series at createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com. One more time, createmasterfulcourses.com, and you'll see a 4-part video series to help you turn your book into a masterful course. Or if you're just curious about me and you want to know more, you can find me on social media, your favorite site, at Robin L. Owens, PhD, at Robin L. Owens, PhD, or go on over to my other website, robinlowens.com. And until next time, this is Dr. Robin. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. If you enjoyed it, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. New episodes drop every week, and I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Meanwhile, this is Dr. Robin signing off. See you next time.